In the early months of 1943, when the First Republic P-47 Thunderbolts began arriving at airfields across England, German Luftwaffe pilots couldn't believe their eyes. Through the crosshairs of their Focke-Wulf 190S and Messerschmitt 109S, they saw what appeared to be an enormous, bloated fighter aircraft lumbering through the European skies. After years of combat against sleek British fighters and nimble Soviet Yaks, nothing had prepared them for this sight. The P-47 was massive, the largest single-engine fighter of World War II, and by a considerable margin. Weighing in at over 7 tons when fully loaded, it dwarfed every other fighter in the sky. To put this in perspective, the P-47 was nearly twice the weight of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, and significantly heavier even than the robust Focke-Wulf 190. German pilots, accustomed to the nimble, lightweight designs of their own aircraft, looked at this American behemoth with a mixture of amusement and contempt. "Das ist kein Jäger, das ist ein Bomber," they would joke over their radios, laughing at what they perceived to be American incompetence in fighter design. "That's not a fighter, that's a bomber." Some went further, comparing it to a flying bathtub, or suggesting the Americans had accidentally sent a ground attack aircraft to do air-to-air combat. The nickname Jug, short for Juggernaut, that American pilots had given the Thunderbolt seemed to confirm everything the Germans suspected. This was a flying milk bottle, a 7-ton turkey that would be easy prey for the battle-hardened veterans of the Luftwaffe who had been fighting since the Spanish Civil War. They had faced the best Britain had to offer, the legendary Spitfires and the sturdy Hurricanes, and had held their own through the desperate days of the Battle of Britain. They had dominated the skies over France, Poland, and the Low Countries. They had developed tactics, strategies, and techniques refined through thousands of hours of combat. What threat could this oversized American contraption possibly pose? What could these newcomers, these Americans who had only recently entered the European theater, possibly teach them about air combat? The German pilots' confidence was not entirely unfounded. The P-47 did look ungainly, even comical to trained eyes. Its enormous radial engine, a Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp producing an incredible 2,000 horsepower, gave it a bulbous nose that seemed out of proportion with the rest of the aircraft. The cowling was huge, necessitated by the 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, each requiring cooling airflow. The fuselage was thick and wide, designed to accommodate the complex turbo-supercharger system that ran beneath the pilot's seat and back to the tail, a sophisticated piece of engineering that the Germans didn't fully appreciate at first glance. The wings were thick and stubby compared to the elegant elliptical wings of the Spitfire, or the clean lines of the Messerschmitt. Where German fighters were sleek and purposeful, embodying the Bauhaus principle of form following function, the Thunderbolt looked like it had been assembled from spare parts by a committee that couldn't quite agree on what a fighter should look like. It was by any aesthetic measure, an ugly aircraft, a farmhand among ballerinas. But the Germans were about to learn a lesson that would be written in tracer fire and blood across the skies of Europe: never judge a fighter by its appearance. The P-47 Thunderbolt was about to shatter every preconception they held about American engineering, American pilots, and American determination. What looked like a weakness would prove to be strength, and that milk bottle was about to deliver a very bitter surprise. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt begins not with military specifications or government contracts, but with one man's vision of what a fighter aircraft should be. Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant who had fled the Russian Revolution, was the chief engineer at Republic Aviation. He had a philosophy that ran counter to the prevailing wisdom of fighter design in the late 1930s. While European designers were obsessed with creating lightweight, maneuverable aircraft that could dogfight in tight circles, Kartveli believed the future belonged to fighters that could fly higher, faster, and hit harder than anything else in the sky. He had watched the evolution of air combat with a keen eye, studying reports from Spain and China, and he had come to a conclusion that few others shared. The era of the nimble biplane was over, and the age of the heavy fighter had arrived. Kartveli's background had shaped his thinking in fundamental ways. Having escaped the chaos of revolutionary Russia, he understood that survival often depended on overwhelming force rather than elegant maneuvering. He brought this philosophy to aircraft design, believing that a pilot's best chance of coming home alive was to have superior speed, altitude and firepower. He could afford to sacrifice some agility if it meant his fighter could climb above the enemy, dive faster and deliver a devastating blow before the opposition even knew what hit them. When the United States Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a lightweight interceptor in 1940, Cartveli looked at the specifications and saw a dead end. The Army wanted a fighter powered by a new Allison inline engine, weighing no more than 6,000 pounds, and armed with two .50 caliber machine guns. It was a conservative specification, born from peacetime thinking and budget constraints. The generals who wrote these requirements were still imagining air combat as it had been in the last war, with pilots exchanging fire at close range in relatively slow aircraft. Cartveli knew that such an aircraft would be obsolete before it ever reached production. The war in Europe was already demonstrating that fighters needed more power, more armament, and more protection than anyone had anticipated. Reports from the Battle of Britain showed that lightly armed fighters were struggling against bombers with armored cockpits and self-sealing fuel tanks. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Supermarine Spitfire were both being upgunned and up-armored, growing heavier with each new variant. So Cartveli made a bold decision, one that could have cost him his job and his company its future contracts. He would ignore the Army's specifications and design the fighter he knew they would actually need. It was an enormous gamble. Republic Aviation was not a large company, and it couldn't afford to invest in an aircraft that the military might reject outright. But Cartveli was convinced that events would prove him right, and he persuaded Republic's leadership to back his vision. He started with the most powerful engine available, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine that produced 2,000 horsepower. This was more than twice the power of the engine the Army had specified, and it came with a corresponding increase in weight and complexity. But to make that engine perform at high altitude, where the air was thin and conventional engines gasped for oxygen, he needed a turbo supercharger. The turbo supercharger was a complex piece of machinery that used exhaust gases to spin a turbine, which in turn compressed incoming air and forced it into the engine. It was temperamental, it was heavy, and it required an elaborate system of ducting that ran the length of the aircraft, snaking from the engine, back to the turbo supercharger mounted in the rear fuselage, and then forward again to the intercooler. The ducting alone added hundreds of pounds to the aircraft's weight. But it would allow the P-47 to maintain full power at altitudes where other fighters were struggling, where the air was so thin that pilots needed oxygen masks and the cold was bone deep. Up there above 30,000 feet, Cartveli's fighter would reign supreme. Then came the armament. Cartveli didn't want 2 machine guns, he didn't even want 4, he wanted 8. 8 Browning M2, .50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. The firepower was staggering, unprecedented for a single-engine fighter. The .50 caliber round was a devastating piece of ammunition. Weighing nearly 2 ounces and traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second, it could punch through armor plate, shred aircraft structures, and explode fuel tanks. A single hit could be catastrophic. A sustained burst from 8 guns was apocalyptic. The combined rate of fire meant that in a 2-second burst, the P-47 could throw 6,400 rounds downrange, a storm of lead that could saw a bomber in half or turn a fighter into confetti. The ammunition alone presented enormous challenges. Each gun required hundreds of rounds, and the belts had to feed smoothly at high altitude in sub-zero temperatures while the aircraft pulled multiple Gs in violent maneuvers. Cartveli's team designed an elaborate feed system that snaked through the wings, tested it repeatedly, and refined it until it worked flawlessly. The weight of the ammunition added hundreds of pounds to the aircraft, but Cartveli considered it essential. A fighter that ran out of ammunition after a few seconds of firing was useless. To protect the pilot, Cartveli surrounded the cockpit with armor plate and installed a thick slab of bulletproof glass in the windscreen. The armor wasn't token protection, it was comprehensive. Heavy steel plates behind the pilot's seat, around the sides of the cockpit, and even beneath the seat formed a protective shell. He added self-sealing fuel tanks that would automatically close when punctured, preventing the catastrophic fires that had claimed so many pilots. These tanks used layers of rubber that would swell and seal when exposed to fuel, a technology that was still relatively new but had proven effective. The result was an aircraft that weighed more than twice what the Army had originally specified. Every addition, the armor, the guns, the ammunition, the massive engine, drove the weight higher and higher. When Cartveli presented his design to the Army in 1940, he must have held his breath, wondering if they would reject it out of hand. The specifications called for something light and nimble. What he was offering was a beast, a heavyweight fighter that defied conventional wisdom. The numbers looked absurd on paper, they didn't reject it. The Army took one look at the reports coming from Europe, where fighters were being shot down in droves, and pilots were dying in burning cockpits, and they realized that Cartveli had been right. The Battle of Britain had shown that air combat was brutal and unforgiving. Pilots needed protection, not just speed. They needed to survive being hit, not just avoid being hit. They ordered a prototype, and the work began immediately. In May 1941, the P-47B took to the air for the first time. It was everything Cartveli had promised: fast, powerful, and tough. It could reach speeds of over 400 miles per hour and climb to 40,000 feet. The massive Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine, with its 2,000 horsepower, could haul the heavy fighter up to altitude and push it to speeds that matched or exceeded its lighter contemporary. It was also enormous, weighing in at nearly 13,000 pounds fully loaded, more than twice the weight of a Spitfire. Standing next to it on the tarmac, pilots felt dwarfed. The propeller alone was over 12 feet in diameter. The early test flights revealed both promise and problems. The controls were heavy, as expected with such a large aircraft. The rate of roll was slower than lighter fighters, but the dive performance was exceptional. The P-47 could dive faster than almost anything in the sky, and the stability was remarkable. In high-speed dives, when other fighters would shake themselves apart, the P-47 remained steady. It was a gun platform that could deliver its devastating firepower accurately. Production began in earnest, and by late 1942, the first P-47s were crossing the Atlantic to join the 8th Air Force in England. The logistics of moving hundreds of aircraft across the ocean was a massive undertaking. The pilots who would fly them were young, eager, and largely inexperienced. Most had never seen combat. Many had never even seen Europe. They were farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, college students from California, all trained to fly but untested in battle. They were about to enter a war where the enemy had years of experience and hundreds of kills to their credit. German pilots who had flown in Spain, Poland, France, and Russia now patrolled the skies over occupied Europe, veterans of countless dogfights. And they were going to do it in an aircraft that everyone said was too big, too heavy, and too clumsy to survive. The British pilots looked at the P-47 with skepticism, accustomed to their nimble Spitfires. Even some American pilots wondered if Cartveli had built them a flying coffin. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat over Europe on April 8, 1943. The mission was a fighter sweep over the coast of France, designed to draw up German fighters and give the American pilots their first taste of combat in the European theater. The Thunderbolts climbed to 30,000 feet, their turbo superchargers humming steadily, their pilots scanning the sky for the enemy. Each man sat in his cockpit, watching the horizon, waiting for the dark specks that would signal the approach of the Luftwaffe. They didn't have to wait long. The German fighters came up to meet them, Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, flown by veterans of the Eastern Front and the Battle of Britain. These were not novices, these were not young men fresh from training schools. These were seasoned combat pilots, men who had dozens, sometimes hundreds of kills to their credit. They had faced the best the Soviets and the British could throw at them, and they had prevailed. They had survived the brutal air battles over Russia and the desperate fighting in the skies above England. Now they were going to teach these American newcomers a lesson. They climbed toward the Americans with the confidence of men who had seen it all before. The Germans attacked with confidence, diving down from above and opening fire. They expected the big American fighters to break formation, to panic, to try to turn and fight.
That's what inexperienced pilots did when they were attacked, and turning fights were where the Germans excelled. The FW-190 and the Bf-109 could outturn almost anything in the sky. In a dogfight, circling and twisting at close range, they were deadly. Their lighter weight and superior maneuverability had given them victory after victory. The German pilots expected this fight to be no different. They expected to rack up a few more kills and send the survivors limping back to England with a story to tell. But the P-47 pilots had been trained differently. They had been taught to use their aircraft's strengths and avoid its weaknesses. They had been drilled in tactics that played to the Thunderbolt's advantages. The Thunderbolt couldn't turn with a German fighter, at least not at low speeds and low altitudes. In a slow-speed turning fight, it was outmatched, but it could do something the German fighters couldn't. It could dive. The P-47's massive weight, which seemed like such a liability on paper, became an asset in a dive. Gravity pulled it down like a stone, and its sturdy construction, built to take punishment, meant it could reach speeds that would tear other aircraft apart. The wings stayed on. The fuselage held together, and once it was diving, it could accelerate to speeds where the German fighters simply couldn't follow without risking structural failure. The American pilots dove. They dove hard, pushing their throttles forward, feeling the G-forces press them into their seats as the Thunderbolts accelerated past 400 miles per hour, past 450, past 500. The altimeter unwound rapidly as they plummeted toward the earth. The German pilots tried to follow, pushing their own aircraft into steep dives, but their aircraft began to shake and buffet violently. Control surfaces became sluggish and unresponsive. The airframes, designed for agility rather than raw speed, were being pushed beyond their limits. Some pilots, pushing too hard in their determination to catch the fleeing Americans, found their aircraft breaking apart around them. Wings folded, tail sections tore away. Others, more cautious or more experienced, pulled out of the chase and watched the Americans disappear below. The Americans pulled out of their dives at low altitude and headed for home, leaving the Germans behind, frustrated and empty-handed. It wasn't a decisive victory. No German aircraft were shot down on that first mission, but it was a learning experience for both sides. The Americans learned that their big, heavy fighter could survive in combat. The Germans learned that the P-47 was faster than they had expected, tougher than they had anticipated, and flown by pilots who were learning quickly. The engagement had been brief, a matter of minutes, but those minutes had revealed something important. The P-47 Thunderbolt, which had been dismissed by some critics as too large and unwieldy for air combat, had proven itself capable of holding its own against the vaunted Luftwaffe. The American pilots returned to their bases with their aircraft intact and their confidence boosted. They had met the enemy and survived. For a first mission, that was enough, but the real education was yet to come. As the spring of 1943 turned to summer, the P-47 pilots gained experience and confidence. They learned the capabilities of their aircraft, and they learned the tactics that would keep them alive. They learned to fight in the vertical plane, using their superior speed and dive performance to dictate the terms of engagement. They learned to work in pairs, with one pilot attacking while his wingman covered him. They learned to use their altitude advantage, climbing high above the bomber formations they were escorting and waiting for the German fighters to come up. Each mission added to their knowledge. They discovered that the P-47 could outrun almost anything the Germans had in level flight. They found that it could outdive everything. They learned that while it couldn't turn with the lighter Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs at low speeds, it could outturn them at high speeds, where the heavier aircraft's superior aileron control gave it an advantage. They learned to avoid prolonged turning fights and to use their energy, their speed, and altitude as weapons. They learned to be patient, to wait for the right moment, to strike when they had the advantage, and to break off when they didn't. And they learned to use their guns. The 8.50 caliber machine guns of the P-47 were arranged in two groups of four, one group in each wing. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, they produced a combined rate of fire of over 6,000 rounds per minute. The guns were harmonized, aimed to converge at a point several hundred yards in front of the aircraft. At that convergence point, the cone of fire was devastating. Anything caught in that cone was subjected to a storm of half-inch diameter bullets, each one carrying enough energy to punch through aluminum, steel, and flesh. The armament was truly formidable. Each .50 caliber round weighed about 2 ounces and left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The kinetic energy was immense. The bullets were a mix of ball ammunition, armor-piercing rounds, incendiary rounds, and tracer rounds. The armor-piercing rounds could penetrate the hardened steel plates that protected German cockpits and engines. The incendiary rounds could ignite fuel tanks and hydraulic lines. The tracer rounds showed the pilot where his bullets were going, allowing him to adjust his aim. When all 8 guns were firing, the P-47 was essentially a flying artillery platform. The German pilots began to experience this firepower firsthand, and their contempt for the Thunderbolt turned to respect, then to fear. A Messerschmitt 109 that strayed into the sights of a P-47 could be literally sawed in half by the concentrated fire. Wings were torn off, engines exploded, fuel tanks erupted in flames. Pilots who managed to bail out reported that the sound of 8.50 calibers firing was unlike anything they had ever heard, a deep, hammering roar that seemed to fill the sky. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical damage. German pilots, who had once eagerly engaged American fighters, now thought twice before attacking a formation of P-47. They began to avoid the Thunderbolts when possible, preferring to go after the bombers instead. But the P-47 pilots wouldn't let them. The hunters had become the hunted, and the skies over Europe were changing hands. One German pilot, Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, described an encounter with P-47s in his diary. "The American fighters are much more dangerous than we thought. Their aircraft are incredibly fast in a dive, and their firepower is tremendous. I saw a 109 hit by one of these Thunderbolts. The entire tail section simply disintegrated. The pilot had no chance to bail out." Noak's words captured the shock that German pilots felt when they first tangled with the P-47 in serious numbers. The Thunderbolt didn't just damage aircraft, it obliterated them. The sheer weight of fire from 8.50 caliber machine guns, all converging on a single target, could tear a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf apart in seconds. German pilots, who had grown accustomed to fighting Spitfires and earlier American fighters, found themselves facing something entirely new, a fighter that combined speed, durability, and devastating firepower in ways they hadn't encountered before. Another German ace, Major Gunther Rall, who would end the war with 275 victories, was more succinct. The P-47 was a very dangerous opponent. If you let one get on your tail, you were finished. Rall's assessment was shared by many of his fellow aces. They learned quickly that the P-47 wasn't a fighter to be taken lightly. Its diving speed meant that once a Thunderbolt committed to an attack, there was often no escape. German pilots who tried to dive away found the P-47 following them down, closing the distance, guns hammering. Those who tried to turn and fight discovered that while the P-47 wasn't the most maneuverable fighter in the sky, it was tough enough to absorb punishment and dish out far more in return. The respect and fear that German pilots developed for the Thunderbolt was evident in their reports and diaries throughout 1943 and beyond. The statistics began to tell the story. In May 1943, P-47s claimed their first victories. In June, the numbers increased. By July, the Thunderbolt pilots were shooting down German fighters at a rate that alarmed the Luftwaffe high command. The big clumsy American fighter that they had laughed at was killing their pilots. Each month brought more losses. More experienced German aviators shot down by Americans who were growing more skilled and more confident with every mission. The Luftwaffe found itself in an increasingly desperate situation. Not only were they losing pilots faster than they could replace them, but the quality of replacements was declining. Green pilots with minimal training were thrown into combat against experienced American flyers in superior aircraft. The kill ratios reflected this brutal reality. What had started as a trickle of victories in May became a flood by late summer. The laughter had stopped. German pilots now approached every mission with the knowledge that American Thunderbolts might be waiting above the clouds. But it wasn't just in air-to-air combat that the P-47 excelled. The Thunderbolt's rugged construction and powerful engine made it an ideal platform for ground attack missions. As the Allied air forces gained air superiority over Europe, P-47s were increasingly tasked with attacking ground targets, trains, trucks, tanks, and airfields. The 8.50 caliber guns that were so deadly against aircraft were equally effective against ground targets. A train caught in the open by a flight of Thunderbolts would be riddled with bullets, its locomotive punctured, its cars set ablaze. Trucks would explode, tanks would be disabled, airfields would be left cratered and burning. The transition from air superiority fighter to ground attack aircraft happened naturally as Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe. P-47 pilots became experts at identifying and destroying targets of opportunity. They learned to spot the telltale signs of military convoys, to recognize ammunition trucks that would explode spectacularly when hit, to find aircraft parked at dispersal areas around German airfields. The psychological impact on German ground forces was immense. Soldiers learned to dread clear weather, knowing that it would bring swarms of American fighters hunting anything that moved. Transportation networks were disrupted, supply lines were cut. The Wehrmacht's ability to move men and material was severely degraded by constant P-47 attacks. The P-47 could also carry bombs, up to 2,500 pounds of them. With bombs under the wings and guns blazing, a Thunderbolt could destroy targets that would have required a dedicated bomber to attack. And unlike a bomber, the P-47 could defend itself. German fighters that tried to intercept Thunderbolts on ground attack missions often found themselves in a fight they couldn't win. The Thunderbolt pilots would drop their bombs, then turn on their attackers with those 8 machine guns. Many German interceptors that dove on what they thought were vulnerable ground attack aircraft ended up as smoking wrecks themselves. The versatility of the P-47 as both a bomber and a fighter created tactical dilemmas for German commanders. How do you defend against an aircraft that can bomb your installations and then shoot down the fighters you send to stop it? The answer increasingly was that you couldn't. The combination of bombs and guns made each P-47 a self-contained strike package. Bridges could be destroyed, factories damaged, and fuel depots set ablaze, all by fighters that could fight their way in and fight their way out. This versatility made the P-47 one of the most cost-effective weapons in the Allied arsenal.
No discussion of the P-47 Thunderbolt would be complete without mentioning the 56th Fighter Group, known as Zemke's Wolfpack after their commanding officer, Colonel Hubert Zemke. The 56th was the first P-47 unit to arrive in England in early 1943, and they would become the highest-scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force, with over 1,000 aerial victories by the end of the war. Their reputation was built not just on numbers but on the consistent excellence and tactical discipline that defined every mission they flew. The group's success was so remarkable that it became a model for other fighter units throughout the European theater. Hubert Zemke was a different kind of leader. He was older than most fighter pilots, 30 years old, when he took command of the 56th, and he had a methodical, analytical approach to air combat that set him apart from the more impulsive, aggressive commanders of other units. He studied the tactics of successful fighter pilots, both Allied and German, meticulously analyzing combat reports and debriefing his pilots after every mission. He developed a training program that emphasized teamwork, discipline, and the effective use of the P-47's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. He drilled his pilots relentlessly, teaching them to fight as a unit rather than as individuals seeking personal glory. He taught them to be patient, to wait for the right moment to attack, and to never ever get drawn into a turning fight with a more maneuverable opponent. Zemke understood that the P-47 was a weapon of precision and power, not a dogfighter, and he trained his men accordingly. His leadership style was firm but fair, and his pilots respected him deeply for his knowledge and his genuine concern for their survival. Zemke's approach paid off in spectacular fashion. The 56th Fighter Group produced some of the top American aces of the war, men whose names would become legendary in the annals of military aviation. Francis Gabby Gabreski, who flew with the 56th, scored 28 aerial victories, making him the top American ace in Europe. Robert Johnson scored 27 victories, each one a testament to his skill and courage. David Schilling scored 22.5, establishing himself as one of the most deadly pilots in the European theater. These men and dozens of others like them became masters of the P-47, learning to exploit every advantage the big fighter offered. They learned to use its speed in the dive, its rugged construction, its devastating firepower, and its ability to absorb punishment that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. Under Zemke's tutelage, they became not just pilots, but tacticians and survivors. One of the most famous incidents involving the P-47's toughness occurred on June 26, 1943, when Robert Johnson was attacked by a Focke-Wulf 190 flown by Oberfeldwebel Egon Mayer, one of Germany's top aces with over 100 victories to his name. Mayer got on Johnson's tail and poured cannon fire into the Thunderbolt in a sustained attack that seemed certain to end in Johnson's death. Johnson's aircraft was hit repeatedly, with cannon shells tearing through the fuselage like paper. The shells shattered the canopy, destroyed instruments, punctured the fuel tanks, and wounded Johnson in several places. Blood streamed down his face and his flight suit was torn and burned. His aircraft was so badly damaged that he couldn't bail out. The canopy was jammed shut by the damage. He was trapped in a dying aircraft, with a German ace on his tail, over enemy territory with no hope of friendly assistance. The situation seemed hopeless, and Johnson prepared himself for the end. But the P-47 kept flying. Despite having hundreds of holes in its fuselage, despite having its hydraulic system destroyed, despite having its engine damaged, the Thunderbolt stayed in the air. Johnson managed to dive away from Mayer and head for England. He flew for over 200 miles, nursing his crippled aircraft across the English Channel, and made it back to his base. When he landed, the ground crew counted over 200 holes in his aircraft. The mechanics and armorers who examined the plane were stunned. They had never seen an aircraft so badly damaged that was still flyable. Holes peppered the wings, the tail section, and the fuselage. The hydraulic lines were severed, meaning Johnson had no brakes, no flaps, and limited control over his landing gear. Yet somehow, through a combination of Johnson's skill and the P-47's incredible structural integrity, the aircraft had carried him home. The fact that he had survived, and that the P-47 had brought him home, became legendary. Johnson's story would be retold in pilot-ready rooms and officers' clubs throughout the 8th Air Force, serving as a testament to the Thunderbolt's toughness. Stories like Johnson's spread through the fighter groups. Word traveled fast among the squadrons stationed across England, and within weeks, every P-47 pilot had heard about the incredible beating the Thunderbolt could take. Pilots began to trust their aircraft in a way they had never trusted previous fighters. The earlier aircraft they had flown, the P-39 era Cobra, the P-40 Warhawk, had been fragile by comparison, prone to catastrophic failures when hit by enemy fire. But the P-47 was different. It was built like a tank, with redundant systems and a massive radial engine that could keep running even after taking multiple cannon hits. They knew that the P-47 could take punishment and keep flying. They knew that if they were hit, they had a good chance of making it home. Some pilots reported flying back to base with cylinders blown off their engines, with control surfaces shot away, with fuel tanks punctured and leaking, and still the Thunderbolt flew. This confidence translated into aggressiveness in combat. P-47 pilots were willing to press their attacks, to take risks, because they knew their aircraft could protect them. They would follow German fighters down to the deck, engaging in extended combat that would have been suicidal in lesser aircraft. They would strafe heavily defended ground targets, knowing that their aircraft could absorb the flak and anti-aircraft fire. The psychological advantage this provided was immeasurable. A pilot who trusts his aircraft fights differently, more boldly, more effectively. The Luftwaffe was not blind to the threat posed by the P-47. As American Thunderbolts began to dominate the skies over Europe, German fighter units were forced to adapt their tactics. German intelligence officers compiled reports on the new American fighter, noting its impressive performance characteristics and, more importantly, its ability to sustain damage. Luftwaffe High Command distributed tactical bulletins to fighter wings across occupied Europe, warning pilots about the capabilities of the Thunderbolt and advising them on how to counter it. The freewheeling dogfights that had characterized air combat in the early years of the war gave way to more cautious, calculated approaches. The days when German aces could rack up multiple kills in a single mission through aggressive maneuvering were coming to an end. The P-47 had changed the equation, and German pilots who failed to adjust their tactics paid for it with their lives. German pilots were instructed to avoid prolonged engagements with P-47s. Flight commanders emphasized this point repeatedly in pre-mission briefings. The standard tactic became the hit-and-run attack: dive down from altitude, make a single firing pass, and then dive away before the Thunderbolts could respond. German fighters would climb to 30,000 feet or higher, position themselves upsun of the American formations, and then plunge down at high speed, firing a quick burst at a bomber or escort fighter before pulling up and climbing away. This tactic took advantage of the superior climb rate of the German fighters and avoided playing to the P-47's strengths. The Bf-109 and Fw-190 could both outclimb the Thunderbolt, at least initially, giving German pilots a chance to escape before the Americans could bring their superior numbers and firepower to bear. But it also meant that German fighters were less effective at breaking up American bomber formations, which was their primary mission. A single high-speed pass rarely resulted in a bomber being shot down. The B-17S and B-24S were tough aircraft themselves, capable of absorbing significant damage. What was needed to stop the bomber offensive was sustained, concentrated attacks, exactly the kind of engagement that the P-47's presence made impossible. The result was that more and more American bombers were reaching their targets, dropping their payloads, and returning home safely. The Luftwaffe also began to develop new aircraft specifically designed to counter the American fighters. German engineers worked frantically to design aircraft that could match or exceed the performance of the P-47 and the other American escorts. The Focke-Wulf Tu-152 and the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter were both responses to the threat posed by aircraft like the P-47. The Tu-152 was a high-altitude interceptor designed to operate in the thin air above 40,000 feet, where it could dive down on Allied formations with a speed and altitude advantage. The Me-262, with its revolutionary jet engines, could outrun any piston-engine fighter the Allies possessed. On paper, both aircraft were formidable, but these aircraft came too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome of the air war. The Tu-152 entered service in January 1945, only months before the war's end, and fewer than 50 were ever delivered to operational units. The Me-262 faced chronic engine reliability problems and fuel shortages, and Hitler's insistence on using it as a bomber rather than a fighter delayed its deployment as an interceptor. By the time these advanced aircraft were flying combat missions, Germany's industrial base was crumbling under the weight of round-the-clock Allied bombing, and there simply weren't enough of them to make a difference. The air war over Europe was already lost. Some German pilots, however, continued to underestimate the P-47, and they paid for it with their lives. Despite mounting evidence of the Thunderbolt's capabilities, these aviators clung to their preconceptions about American fighters, believing them to be inferior to their own aircraft. This overconfidence would prove fatal. There are numerous accounts of experienced German aces who, confident in their abilities and their aircraft, engaged P-47s in combat and were shot down. These weren't novice pilots making rookie mistakes, these were seasoned veterans with dozens, sometimes hundreds of kills to their names. Yet time and again, they found themselves outmatched by the big American fighter they had dismissed as a jug.
The Thunderbolt's combination of speed, firepower, and toughness proved to be a deadly surprise for pilots who expected an easy victory. What they thought would be a simple bounce turned into a life-or-death struggle, and many didn't survive the encounter. One such pilot was Hauptmann Hans Philipp, a Luftwaffe ace with 206 victories to his credit. His record spoke for itself. He was among the elite of Germany's fighter pilots, a name spoken with respect in Luftwaffe circles. Philipp was one of Germany's most experienced fighter pilots, a veteran of the Eastern Front and the Battle of Britain. He had survived countless dogfights against Soviet and British aircraft, developing the kind of combat instinct that kept pilots alive. He had flown through some of the most intense aerial battles of the war and emerged victorious time and time again. On October 8, 1943, he engaged a formation of P-47s over Germany. It was supposed to be another mission, another opportunity to add to his impressive tally of victories. Confident in his abilities, he pressed his attack, maneuvering his Messerschmitt into position for what should have been a killing shot. But the P-47 pilots were ready. They had been trained well, and they knew their aircraft's strengths. In the ensuing fight, Philipp's aircraft was hit by .50 caliber fire from a Thunderbolt flown by Lieutenant Robert Johnson, the same pilot who had survived Egon Mayer's attack months earlier. The heavy bullets tore through Philipp's fighter with devastating effect. Philipp's Messerschmitt 109 exploded in a ball of flame, and he was killed instantly. There was no time for him to bail out, no chance for survival. One moment he was an ace with over 200 kills, the next he was gone. The loss of such an experienced pilot was a blow to the Luftwaffe, and it demonstrated that even the best German pilots were vulnerable to the P-47. Philipp's death sent shockwaves through the German fighter community and served as a sobering reminder that the Americans had brought a formidable weapon to the European skies. As 1943 turned to 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt evolved from a pure fighter into a multi-role aircraft. The transition wasn't planned from the beginning, but the aircraft's robust design and powerful engine made it a natural candidate for expanded roles. While it continued to excel in air-to-air combat, racking up impressive kill ratios against German fighters, it was increasingly used for ground attack missions. Pilots discovered that the same qualities that made it a deadly fighter, its ruggedness, its heavy armament, and its ability to absorb punishment, also made it exceptional at attacking ground targets. The invasion of Europe was approaching, and the Allied air forces needed aircraft that could support ground troops, destroy enemy infrastructure, and maintain air superiority. They needed versatility, not specialization. The P-47 could do all of these things, and do them well. The Thunderbolt's ability to carry external stores, bombs, rockets and drop tanks made it incredibly versatile. Engineers had designed strong hardpoints under the wings that could accommodate a variety of ordnance configurations. The aircraft could be loaded for different mission profiles depending on what was needed that day. A typical ground attack mission might see a P-47 carrying two 500-pound bombs under the wings, along with a full load of ammunition for its 8 machine guns. The bombs alone could devastate a target, but the real destruction came from the combination of explosives and bullets. The pilot would fly to the target area, often at low altitude to avoid radar detection, dive down to attack with speed building rapidly, release the bombs with precision timing, and then strafe the target with machine gun fire, ensuring maximum destruction. The .50 caliber rounds could tear through vehicles, buildings and personnel with equal effectiveness. If enemy fighters appeared during the mission, the pilot could jettison any remaining external stores to improve flight performance and engage in air-to-air combat, transitioning seamlessly from ground attack to air superiority. This adaptability made the P-47 an invaluable asset in the months leading up to D-Day and beyond. This versatility came at a cost. Ground attack missions were dangerous. Flying low and slow to attack ground targets made the P-47 vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. Many Thunderbolt pilots were lost to flak, the German term for anti-aircraft artillery. The threat was constant and unforgiving. Every mission into enemy territory meant flying through a gauntlet of German gunners who had spent years perfecting their deadly craft. The pilots knew that one well-placed shell could end their lives in an instant, yet they flew mission after mission, day after day. But the P-47's rugged construction meant that it could often survive hits that would have destroyed other aircraft. There are numerous accounts of P-47s returning from missions with cylinders shot out of their engines, with wings riddled with holes, with control surfaces barely attached, and still managing to land safely. Mechanics would gather around these battered aircraft, shaking their heads in disbelief at the punishment the planes had endured. Some Thunderbolts came back with entire sections of wing missing, others with tail assemblies hanging by a thread. The ground crews developed an almost reverent respect for the durability of the machine they serviced. They had seen too many examples of what should have been fatal damage that somehow wasn't. One of the most remarkable demonstrations of the P-47's toughness occurred on March 5, 1944, when Lieutenant Colonel Robert Basler was leading a ground attack mission over Germany. His P-47 was hit by anti-aircraft fire, and a shell exploded in the cockpit, wounding him severely. Shrapnel tore through his legs and abdomen. He was bleeding heavily and in tremendous pain. The cockpit was filled with smoke and the acrid smell of explosives. For a moment, Basler thought he was going to die right there, thousands of feet above enemy territory. But his P-47 was still flying. The engine continued to run smoothly, despite the chaos in the cockpit. The controls, though damaged, still responded to his touch. Basler, barely conscious, managed to fly his aircraft back to England, a distance of over 300 miles. It was a journey that seemed impossible. He drifted in and out of consciousness, fighting to stay alert, fighting to keep the aircraft straight and level. The pain was overwhelming, but every time he felt himself slipping away, he forced himself to focus on the instruments, on keeping the nose pointed toward home. Other pilots in his formation stayed with him, talking to him over the radio, encouraging him, guiding him back. He landed at the first airfield he saw and was rushed to surgery. He survived, and he credited the P-47's toughness with saving his life. Without that aircraft, he told anyone who would listen, he would have died over Germany that day. Stories like Basler's reinforced the P-47's reputation as a pilot's aircraft. It was forgiving of mistakes, it could absorb tremendous damage, and it would bring you home. This reputation made it popular with pilots, even those who had initially been skeptical of the big, heavy fighter. Word spread through the squadrons about the Thunderbolt's survivability. Pilots who had flown other aircraft and then transitioned to the P-47 were often amazed at the difference. They felt safer, more confident, knowing that their aircraft could take a beating and keep flying. The P-47 became more than just a machine. It became a trusted companion, a partner that pilots could rely on when everything went wrong. On June 6, 1944, the Allied forces launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. The P-47 Thunderbolt played a crucial role in the success of the invasion. It was one of the most important days in the war, and the Thunderbolt was at the center of it all. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, P-47s flew thousands of sorties, attacking German positions, destroying transportation networks, and maintaining air superiority over the invasion beaches. They bombed bridges and railway lines, strafed convoys and troop concentrations, and shot down any Luftwaffe aircraft that dared to challenge them. The goal was to isolate the Normandy battlefield, to prevent the Germans from reinforcing their positions once the invasion began. On D-Day itself, Thunderbolts provided close air support for the troops landing on the beaches, attacking German strongpoints, and preventing enemy reinforcements from reaching the front lines. The pilots flew mission after mission, sometimes making multiple sorties in a single day. They could see the ships offshore, the landing craft heading toward the beaches, the explosions and chaos of the battle below. They dove on German bunkers and machine gun nests, dropping bombs and firing rockets, doing everything they could to help the men on the ground. The P-47s were instrumental in breaking German resistance and allowing the Allied forces to establish a foothold in France. The P-47's ability to operate from rough improvised airfields made it ideal for supporting the rapid advance across France. As Allied forces pushed inland, P-47 units moved with them, setting up operations at captured German airfields or hastily constructed landing strips. This mobility was one of the Thunderbolt's greatest assets in the fast-moving campaign. Engineers would work around the clock to prepare these forward bases, often under enemy fire, laying down pierced steel planking, or simply grading the dirt to create usable runways. Within hours of an airfield's capture, P-47s would be landing, refueling, and taking off again. From these forward bases, Thunderbolts could reach targets deep in German-held territory, attacking supply lines, troop concentrations, and retreating German forces. The shortened distance to the front meant more time over target and less fuel burned in transit, allowing pilots to carry heavier bomb loads and spend more time hunting for targets of opportunity. The German army, already reeling from the invasion, found itself under constant air attack. Columns of vehicles were strafed and bombed, trains were destroyed, bridges were knocked out, roads became killing zones as P-47s prowled overhead, searching for anything that moved. The Thunderbolts attacked in waves, hitting German forces from dawn until dusk, giving them no respite and no chance to regroup. Supply convoys that tried to move during daylight hours were decimated. German commanders were forced to move their forces at night, which slowed their response times and created logistical nightmares. The P-47, with its 8 machine guns and bomb load, became a symbol of Allied air power. Each 50-caliber machine gun could fire 850 rounds per minute, and when all 8 fired together, the result was devastating. German soldiers learned to fear the sound of the Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine. That distinctive 2,000 horsepower growl became a herald of destruction. When they heard that distinctive roar, they knew that death was coming from above. Veterans would later recall diving into ditches, abandoning their vehicles, and praying that the American fighters would pass them by. By the fall of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Years of attrition had taken their toll. Experienced pilots had been killed or captured. The aces who had once dominated the skies were gone, replaced by teenagers with minimal training. Fuel shortages limited training for new pilots. Many German pilots went into combat with less than 100 hours of flight time, while their Allied opponents often had 300 hours or more. This experience gap proved fatal. Aircraft production, despite heroic efforts, could not keep pace with losses. German factories, now under constant bombardment, struggled to maintain output. The P-47, along with other Allied fighters like the P-51 Mustang and the British Spitfire, had achieved air superiority over Europe. The skies belonged to the Allies, and German ground forces operated without air cover, exposed and vulnerable. German fighters were rarely seen, and when they did appear, they were usually outnumbered and outfought. A lone Me-109, or FW-190, might try to attack a bomber formation, only to find itself swarmed by a dozen Allied fighters. The battles when they occurred were brief and one-sided, but the P-47 pilots did not become complacent. They knew that the Luftwaffe still had teeth, and that a moment of carelessness could be fatal. Even a wounded animal can bite, and German pilots, though outnumbered and undertrained, could still be dangerous. They continued to fly their missions with professionalism and skill, attacking targets, escorting bombers, and engaging any German fighters that dared to challenge them. They maintained their formations, checked their six, and kept their eyes scanning the sky. Discipline and vigilance kept them alive. Every pilot knew someone who had been shot down, and that knowledge kept them sharp and focused on their missions. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt had compiled an impressive record. P-47s had destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft, more than half of them in air-to-air combat. They had flown over 546,000 combat sorties and dropped over 132,000 tons of bombs. They had destroyed thousands of locomotives, vehicles, and other ground targets. The numbers were staggering and spoke to the Thunderbolt's versatility and effectiveness. In addition to aircraft and vehicles, P-47s had destroyed countless bridges, fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and rail yards. They had disrupted German logistics, to the point where entire army groups found themselves immobilized for lack of supplies. And they had done all of this while suffering a lower loss rate than most other Allied fighters. The P-47's rugged construction and ability to absorb punishment meant that pilots often made it home even after sustaining heavy damage. Stories abounded of Thunderbolts returning to base with cylinders shot out, tail sections riddled with holes, and control surfaces barely functional. The aircraft's reputation for bringing its pilots home alive was well earned and deeply appreciated by the men who flew it. The P-47's success was due to a combination of factors: its rugged construction, its powerful engine, its devastating firepower, and the skill of the pilots who flew it. But perhaps most importantly, it was due to the vision of Alexander Cartville, who had designed an aircraft that could survive and thrive in the brutal environment of aerial combat. The Thunderbolt was built like a tank, with a thick fuselage that could absorb tremendous punishment and still bring its pilot home. Its Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine, producing over 2,000 horsepower, gave it the power to chase down enemy fighters and escape from dangerous situations. And its armament was nothing short of devastating: 8.50 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings, each one capable of tearing through enemy aircraft with ease. The German pilots who had laughed at the P-47 when it first appeared over Europe had learned a hard lesson. The big ugly American fighter was not a joke, it was a killer. Its 8.50 caliber machine guns, which could fire over 6,000 rounds per minute, had rained lead on German fighters and ground targets alike. German aces who had grown accustomed to the lighter, more nimble British Spitfires and American P-51 Mustangs found themselves outgunned and overwhelmed by the sheer firepower of the Thunderbolt. In a head-on pass, the P-47's concentrated wall of fire could shred an enemy aircraft in seconds. On the ground, its ability to carry bombs and rockets made it a terror to German armored columns and supply lines. The Thunderbolt had proven that in aerial combat, as in so many other things, appearances can be deceiving. What looked like a lumbering giant was actually a precisely engineered weapon of war. The P-47 Thunderbolt remained in service with the United States Air Force until 1955, long after most other World War II fighters had been retired. It served in the Korean War, primarily in the ground attack role, and it was used by numerous foreign air forces around the world. Countries from Brazil to Turkey to the Philippines operated the Thunderbolt well into the 1950s, finding it to be a reliable and effective aircraft for a variety of missions. Some nations used it for counterinsurgency operations, while others employed it as a trainer to prepare pilots for the jet age. But its greatest legacy is not in its longevity, but in what it represented: a triumph of engineering, a testament to the courage of the pilots who flew it, and a reminder that in war, the side that can adapt, innovate, and persevere will ultimately prevail. The P-47 embodied the American approach to warfare: build it strong, arm it heavily, and trust in the bravery and skill of those who operate it. Today, a handful of P-47 Thunderbolts remain airworthy, maintained by dedicated enthusiasts who want to preserve the memory of this remarkable aircraft. These lovingly restored machines are kept flying through countless hours of maintenance and the tireless efforts of mechanics, engineers, and pilots who understand the historical significance of keeping these warbirds in the sky. When one of these restored Thunderbolts takes to the air, with its massive radial engine roaring and its propeller clawing at the sky, it's easy to imagine what it must have been like to be a German pilot in 1943, looking up and seeing a formation of these giants bearing down, their 8 machine guns ready to unleash hell. The sound alone, that distinctive growl of the R-2800 engine, must have struck fear into the hearts of enemy pilots who knew what was coming. And when those 8 guns opened fire, the sky would be filled with tracer rounds and the smell of cordite, a deadly reminder of American air power at its peak.
The P-47 Thunderbolt was never the most elegant fighter aircraft, It was never the most maneuverable. It couldn't turn as tightly as a Spitfire or climb as quickly as a Messerschmitt Buff 109. But it was tough, it was powerful, and it was deadly. It could take hits that would have downed other fighters and still make it home. It could dive faster than almost any aircraft in the sky, using its weight and power to run down fleeing enemies. And when it caught them, its 8 machine guns ensured that few escaped. The German pilots who underestimated it paid the price, and in the end the Thunderbolt helped to win the war in the skies over Europe, one burst of .50 caliber fire at a time. Its contribution to victory cannot be overstated: thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed, countless ground targets eliminated, and bomber formations protected on their long missions deep into enemy territory. The P-47 Thunderbolt earned its place in history as one of the great fighter aircraft of World War II. The laughter of those German pilots, so confident in their superiority, was silenced by the thunder of 8 Browning machine guns. They had underestimated the massive American fighter, dismissing it as too large, too heavy to be a threat in aerial combat. But they were wrong, dead wrong. The P-47 had proven that sometimes the biggest, toughest fighter wins. It wasn't about elegance or maneuverability alone. It was about raw power, devastating firepower, and the ability to absorb punishment and keep fighting. And in the skies over Europe from 1943 to 1945, the Thunderbolt was the toughest fighter of them all. It could dive like a meteor, unleashing destruction on enemy formations. It could take hits that would tear other fighters apart and still bring its pilot home. Day after day, the Thunderbolt dominated the skies, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory, strafing ground targets, and engaging the Luftwaffe in dogfights that would become legend. The P-47 earned its reputation in blood and fire, becoming a symbol of American air power and the instrument that helped turn the tide of the air war over Europe.